Hello, I'm Hazm Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Modi's scorecard. 1 year in power, how has the Prime Minister changed India? We'll look at the big picture that speaks to success and on the ground where little has changed. Also this week, taking on Google and Gazprom, the new competition commissioner in Brussels gives Al Jazeera an insight into why it's taking on the titans of the gas and tech world.
I'm Harry Fawcett in Nepal, where the country's vast potential for hydroelectric power is seen as one possible route for economic recovery after the earthquake. But the earthquake has also highlighted the risks posed to installations like this.
It's been 1 year since India's Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party was sworn into office. Led by Narendra Modi, it claimed a landslide election victory by promising widespread reforms that would reposition India as a global power. The Prime Minister has travelled the globe from Beijing to New York, trying to convince investors to tap into India's economic potential. But has he managed to deliver? Well, let's take a look at three metrics. If we're comparing it to the last year of the Congress administration, it would appear investors are pouring money in, more than $8 billion more. Inflation has risen, but far less than under the government of Manmohan Singh. And GDP has risen to more than 7% and will outpace China for the first time. But now the caveat. Inflation has risen at a slower pace because global oil prices have fallen, and GDP is up because the way the government measures it has changed. Well, no one expects massive change in 1 year, but Modi's plans are ambitious. Take a look at this infographic produced by our web team. Scroll through and you'll see that by 2022, there is a pledge to create 100 million jobs, boost power production, and get a high-speed train network built. See what we mean by ambitious, but right now there's not much to show to people on the street. Nidhi Dutt has this report from New Delhi.
A year ago, a new Indian government came to power, promising to clean up the country's politics as well as its neighborhoods. But not much has changed in this community in the heart of New Delhi. Despite her optimism at the ballot box, Mangani says life is just as hard as it was 12 months ago.
I don't know why I voted. What's the use? We're so poor. We have nothing. No one helps us. We are sick and we have no one to turn to.
Well before his first day in office, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said tackling India's sanitation crisis would be his government's top priority.
Looking around this neighborhood, it's easy to see why voters here are just as disenchanted with this government as they were with the last. But it's not just people in need of the basics who continue to struggle, despite the BJP's promise of change.
Kulbir Singh Virk was excited when last year the government announced plans to turn India into a global manufacturing hub. That should have increased orders for Virk, who runs a garment export business. But he says business has been anything but brisk.
There is a huge fight for even small margins. The system hasn't really been upgraded. We do get to hear that big changes will be made, but as of now, we don't see any progress.
That's a common complaint against the Bharatiya Janata Party that won its biggest electoral mandate in May last year. And observers warn in India, euphoria dissipates quickly.
In first year and the second year, people start getting unease, unrest. The unease starts happening. And after 2 years, I think if the government is unable to deliver something, then people start agitating, and then it's very difficult for the government to turn the tide.
And dissatisfaction is growing in communities like this one. While the government says it will take more than a year to make the big changes India desperately needs, people living here say even the small ones are hard to see.
Let's get more now from Prashant Sawant, economist at risk management company Maplecroft. Thank you for being with us. Now, firstly, on the economy, taking into account all of the metrics that we mentioned earlier, GDP and inflation, who takes the credit for that?
Well, when it comes to inflation, I think Modi got a bit lucky there because the oil prices globally has started coming down since the middle of 2014. And India is not the only country, but we can see globally many countries are experiencing low level of inflation. And in certain countries, almost there is a situation of deflation. Also, very important to note at this point of time is the governor of RBI. He pressed with the government to introduce inflation targeting. This is the first time ever introduced in India to have a target for the inflation and try to achieve those targets. On the GDP front, India's economy is expected to grow faster over the next 12 to 18 months. This is also basically because of the revision of the GDP methodology. That has been a controversial methodology indeed. But having said that, considering India is a vast and a diverse economy, and also nearly more than 50%, I would say, of India's economy isn't accounted for, which is the informal sector. So I do not see any problem with India's economy getting into a recessionary mode. The growth will remain strong.
And as far as the challenges ahead, there are the issues of land reform and the tax on international companies. Can he get that through?
The problem, although he has a majority in the lower house of the parliament, which is Lok Sabha, he doesn't have the majority in the upper house, the Rajya Sabha. And rightly so, Modi, though he is perceived as a pro-business prime minister, there are certain policies which he has introduced and he's trying to tweak are not necessarily be considered as in favor of the agriculture sector for India, for instance, or even for the small and medium-sized sector in India. And that has been the main reason for the opposition party opposing the bill. We saw the goods and services tax, which was introduced, and it was supposed to get implemented in the beginning of the next financial year, which is in April 2016, I think it's unlikely to happen so soon, because there is still a problem getting the consensus at the central level. Also, there is a bit of a dichotomy in the opinion. The Modi government, BJP, when they were in the opposition, they lashed the previous government for introducing retrospective taxes on foreign companies. But we just saw recently that the tax authorities have gone after the foreign companies and charging them minimum alternative tax on retrospective basis.
And how has he handled international relations, particularly with China?
I think that is the major, if we were to say, a major achievement from these Modi's government. We know that India and China do not see almost eye to eye when it comes to the political relationship, but they are great trade partners. China is India's #1 trading partner, and recognizing that fact, only that the economic relationship can possibly smoothen out the differences on the political front. And therefore, they have seen each other twice in the last 12 months. In fact, the formation of BRIC Bank, though it will be based in China, the first chairperson of this BRIC Bank is an Indian, and that also will strengthen the economic relationship between these two countries.
Prashant Sawant from Maplecroft, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you, Hassan.
Still ahead on Counting the Cost, just a month after the devastating earthquake in Nepal, we see what progress is being made to help rebuild the country. So last week we told you that Brussels is taking on Russian state-controlled gas company Gazprom. The European Commission says Gazprom is abusing its power in Eastern and Central Europe, charges which the company denies. Moscow believes the allegations are politically motivated. Not surprising, since Gazprom is seen as a foreign policy tool for the Kremlin. But the Commission has also opened up another front against tech giant Google. It doesn't like the way Google displays search results, favouring its own products and services above those of its rivals. The European Union has pedigree. It's taken on the likes of Microsoft, fining the software giant more than 1.6 billion euros. Well, both cases have been brought by the European Union's new competition chief, Margrethe Vestager. And I'm delighted to say she's joining us now from Brussels. Thank you for being with us. Now, the United States seems to have a very poor record on tackling monopoly behavior. Is that the reason why the European Commission has to step in?
No, not at all. The US and the EU jurisdictions are, of course, completely different. They do their job and we do ours when it concerns the EU markets. And if we find facts and evidence to support misuse of a dominant position, then, of course, we address that to the company.
Well, let's give you one example. Intel was only fined $6 million by US authorities in one case, essentially a slap on the wrist, some would say. But the EU fined Intel 1.4 billion euros for its monopolistic behavior in the chip market.
Well, I think you'd find that there is a number of differences. We work very closely with the US authorities on concrete cases, for instance, merger control. But of course, it sometimes boils down to the fact that there is a different history, there is a different way of looking at the administrative system and level of fines. And of course, in Europe, we have to justify to our voters, to our legislator, that we do what is expected and by the law in a European jurisdiction, no matter how the American system works.
Let's talk about Gazprom. You've accused it of abusing its market power in Eastern Europe. Are your decisions ever political? Do you think Gazprom acts as a foreign policy tool for Moscow?
Well, the decisions when it concerns enforcement of competition law cannot be political, because our decisions, our accusations, our cases, they may have to stand up in court. And court will rely on facts, interpretation of facts, evidence, not on political opinions or what may have been convenient in some or another political situation. And therefore, it would be extremely critical if law enforcement was ever used as a political tool.
So what's your case against Google and Gazprom?
Well, the two cases have very little in common, but they have one thing in common, which is the fact that we look at very dominant companies, strong, successful companies, and that is completely all right. Problem is if that strength is being misused, either to charge higher prices or to promote one's own services in neighboring markets or to keep others out. And those are the issues that we have with Gazprom and Google. And I guess the only other thing they have in common is that their name begins with a G.
Are you protecting EU companies? There's no European equivalent of Amazon, Google or Facebook.
Well, there is at least two things which are important. One thing is to keep the market open so that new and innovative companies can thrive and the competition is fair. And the second thing which we are working on is to create a capital market which to a larger degree can support also European businesses when they're about to take off and grow. Because that is for Europeans a bad comparison with the US, where they have a much more vibrant capital market and a much more integrated ecosystem when it comes to innovation, capital founding, and then growth. So yes, there are things we can do, but this has to do with using the market, enabling fair competition, enabling businesses to grow, not by protecting our market from other businesses.
And do you think the EU should be going after the banking sector? I mean, up to now, they've paid more than $200 billion in fines, yet their behavior has not changed. Are these banks truly too big to be broken up?
Well, you know, of course, that we have passed very strong legislation in Europe during the crisis year in order to regulate the financial sector much tighter, maybe making it slightly more boring to be a banker, but to make sure that looking forward we will have a much more healthy, much more modest banking sector. We will, of course, investigate if we find that there is evidence, if we have suspicions of foul play, but we don't go after the sector as such. Banking and financing of businesses is, of course, a very crucial task to be managed in a growing economy.
Margaret Vestager, EU Competition Chief, thanks very much for joining us on Counting the Cost. Now, even before last month's earthquake, Nepal's economy was in bad shape, depending on money sent back by hundreds of thousands of overseas workers. Hydroelectricity has long been seen as having the potential to transform the country economically, but its development has been slow. Now, the government says the quake could actually promote growth in that sector. As Harry Fawcett reports now from Nepal.
More than a month after the earthquake, and the Sonkoshi hydroelectric plant is out of commission, awaiting repair. 13 plants across the country are thought to have been affected by the 7.8 magnitude quake on April the 25th, May's 7.3 magnitude aftershock, or both. It could take Sonkoshi months more to get back online.
It's been severely damaged. The bridge was damaged, the generator house, the hydro was damaged.
But there are other threats to the safety of these facilities. What's interesting about the damage you can see here is that much of it wasn't caused in the earthquake. It was caused by flooding after a landslide which happened last year. It's a sign that the very geology which gives Nepal such potential for hydroelectric power also threatens it. Further upstream, the Chinese company building this project stopped work on the day of the quake. But the government is telling would-be investors that this is just the time, after the big seismic event so long predicted, to put their money into Nepal.
That's what, I tell the developers, because, we haven't had earthquakes for the last 80 years. A big one happened now. So let's say, looking back at the history, every 70, 80 years, big earthquakes have gone in Nepal. So hopefully they can be confident.
Pant says a landmark deal signed last year with India points the way. The agreement would see an Indian company build a 900 megawatt plant. Nepal would receive electricity from India in the short term and export it the other way in the long term. Hydropower expansion has long been the subject of political wrestling, not just over concerns about what it might do to the country's matchless natural environment, but also over fears that a sovereign resource will be sold down the river to a southern big brother.
Investment is not a problem. That's where I disagree with you.
Hydroelectric engineer and former water minister Deepak Gyawali says India would get regularized water flow, free, and electricity on the cheap.
If you export electricity, the factories are going to be set up there, not here. And our guys won't get jobs in their country. They'll have to go, they go to Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Malaysia right now, grinding their bones off. Well, they'll have to do that in India in 50-degree heat now.
Nepal uses just 1% of its estimated 82,000 megawatt hydroelectric potential. There's broad agreement that this powerful resource needs to be better harnessed as part of post-quake recovery. But just how that should be done remains a divisive issue. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost in the Botakoshi River Valley, Nepal.
Well, Harry also caught up with Nepal's Information Minister Minendra Rijal and asked him what needed to be done and how they would overcome corruption. Here's that interview.
The challenges that we are facing is, first, in just about a month, we should be able to provide money for people to buy GI sheets and provide, be able to assure supply of GI sheets for the people who need, and then help them rebuild temporary shelter. That's one. Second, providing water treatment medicines. That's going to be tremendously important. And third, as I mentioned earlier also, saving people from the areas where there is a huge chance of flash floods.
But in terms of the pace of what you're able to offer, you're saying maybe in a month you'll be able to offer people the kind of money they require to build temporary shelter. Even this weekend we've seen landslides, we've seen here in Kathmandu a pretty aggressive storm on Saturday evening, which has ripped through tents and so on. Is that quick enough to get people proper temporary
shelter? When I said 1 month, I'm not saying that they'll have, all of them will have to wait until 1 month. What I'm basically saying is this is the handing out cash is going to start in just about a day or two. Even in the remotest village in the country, within a month we should be not just able to provide money, but provide supplies so that they can purchase it and then build that temporary shelter, and this would be in temporary shelter within a month. That's what I was implying.
And in terms of the funding, how much has been committed? How much has come in?
Even if we do not get enormous amount of funding immediately, right, relief part we'll be able to handle with the money that people from the country are providing, some support that's coming from outside, including Asian Development Bank, Bhutanese government, some of the Arabian countries also are providing some business people from other countries, many within the country. But more challenging would be getting enough support for the National Reconstruction Plan. Initially, what we have said is we need probably about $2 billion US. Government has set aside $200 million US allocated already. So there's a funding gap of $1.8 billion.
Well, there is skepticism, isn't there, both here and in the international community on that front. We saw in March, a month before the earthquake, a British parliamentary committee recommending cutting British aid to Nepal unless it dealt with what it called endemic corruption and poor governance. So how do you convince both your own population and potential donors that this money will be used properly and it will find the people that need it?
I cannot just say these are baseless criticisms. We are a country that had to go through 10 years of violent struggle and then trying to build a peace, and we have not yet been able to write constitution even after the peace process started, 10 years after the peace process started. There is some amount of skepticism people have about their political leaders, about us. Guaranteeing transparency is going to be important. Making it corruption free is going to be important. And equally important would be making effective use of every penny that's there in the fund.
Let's move on to one of the key economic earners for this country, the remittances from overseas labour. The Labour Minister has been quoted as criticising Qatar for not allowing all of the Nepali workers working in the World Cup construction there to come home for funerals and to visit family members, make sure people are okay. It's quite rare, I think, for Nepal to publicly criticise a country like Qatar when it relies on this money for, I think it's 20% of GDP comes from remittances. So that would suggest there's pretty strong feeling on this matter.
I do not know, if Labour Minister has said that or not, because at times, you see something reported in the press is not accurate account of what the person had to say. Having said that, I'll also add this. Qatar is a very important country. Remittance, very important for us. So anything we say will have to keep this perspective intact. If we say something that's going to put in peril the job and employment of so many people who are working in Qatar, in many other Arabian countries and other countries outside the country. We're talking about more than 3 million Nepali people living outside. If anything that is possible to bring home people who have thus lost somebody in the family, I'll be very happy to work it out with the individual employers.
Okay, Minendra Rijal, thank you very much for speaking to us today.
Thank you.
So that's our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. And that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Sika from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is up next.